very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. I can't possibly match John's magnificent range of argument and superb presentation. You'll find these are rather more ruminations than a totally coherent argument. Once when Asquith was Prime Minister, he made a speech for about 3 hours in the House of Commons about the licensing laws, with enormous complication. Very, very complicated speech. And a journalist came up to him in the lobby afterwards and said, Mr. Asquith, I need to report this very quickly, and I wonder if I could have your notes, because I couldn't get all of it. And he said, by all means, and he handed him his notes, and all it was a card which said, too many pubs. I'm not going to speak for 3 hours, you'll be pleased to know, and I can't rival Asquith's eloquence, but I have copied him in one respect, because I've only written out one sentence, which is, just because something doesn't work, doesn't mean that it won't happen. And this is something which I think Eurosceptics have failed to understand, and are still failing to understand right now. But how I talk to you tonight is governed by the fact that I believe, from a long study of the Bruges Group, that you are mostly Eurosceptics, and that therefore you don't need tremendous sort of persuasion on this point. And if I was speaking to a general audience, I would almost say the opposite of what I'm saying now. That's to say, if I was speaking to a general audience, I would argue very strongly from a Eurosceptic position and try to persuade them of that importance. But speaking to you, I want to talk a bit about some of the difficulties of the position and why I think we have consistently failed, and are still to some extent failing, in getting across the right points and in prevailing. And the first thing I want to say is that I think, and I say this partly because I come from a background where my family are all liberals with a big L, and we're all tremendous European supporters, and I am the black sheep of my family. And when I was growing up, of course, which is in the 1970s, the whole European argument was coming through very strongly, and I was brought up to believe in it. When I was at university in the late 70s, I changed my mind, I suppose, for essentially what would then be called power-like reasons about Britain as having an independent parliamentary government, and that's essentially my position today. But what I did learn from my background, and which I've retained, I hope, is a respect for people who don't agree with this. I don't think they're all people who just are anti-British and are contemptible traitors. I think they've thought about it a lot, some of them, and they have...
Sorry, they are.
Well, I know that some will... and some of them, by the way, are. I have met Europhiles who just don't like Britain, and would simply much rather be ruled by anybody who wasn't British. It's absolutely true, but I think very big misunderstanding to think that that is what we're up against. We're up against a series of beliefs which have some ground, some good sense in them, some grounding, but then are greatly in error. I think the obvious beliefs are to do with the importance of recognizing that you're part of a whole continent, that you're part of a wider culture, that you have a lot of common values, and that you messed up tremendously and killed people in millions when you didn't adequately recognize that. And that therefore there had to be a different set of institutions, was the theory, to remedy that, and in particular to remedy the natural conflict between France and Germany, which had come about, we think of it as coming about twice, but really it came about at least 4 times in European history. The question then also became, in British minds, I'm talking here about British Europhiles, what do you do about Britain when Britain is no longer the greatest or second greatest world power? And again, this is not it's not unreasonable to think that if you are declining in your power, you need to get into a series of different alliances from what you would have had if you're top nation. And when people speak about independent nations, as we all do believe in them, we do, however, need to recognize that the independence of a very weak country is a very fragile thing, even if it's perfect independence on paper. And that is a thing which is not adequately acknowledged by some, and which governed a lot of the British Europhile thinking. So I think one reason why our arguments have not prevailed in British audiences as much as they should have, because they are basically right, is because we have too often insulted the motives of our opponents. And that is why people think we're lunatics. Because they say, you know, we're all foaming at the mouth and shouting and saying how wicked the European setup is when, and the sort of common sense thing people say, well, you know, I go to Europe, I think it's a pretty nice place, I've got French friends, etc., etc. And they think that Eurosceptics are living in a sort of fantasy world, and a world that's hostile to anything that isn't British. And they're largely wrong about that, but they're not completely wrong about that, and I think we need to think about that. And then I think there's another wider question which we need to think about, which is, why do people on the continent believe, even now, so strongly in the European Union? Now, I would readily agree that this is primarily the belief of elites, not the wider populations, but it is also a belief of wider populations. And it's very strongly so in some, though not all, of the European countries. And even now, you get a large majority of people in Spain and even in Greece who say they want to stay in the euro. Here's this thing, here's this thing that's absolutely visibly destroying their economies and therefore threatening their social structure. And even, you know, one's only exaggerating a bit when saying that it's making people go hungry. And yet, they still want it. And one has to sort of think about that. And, you know, why is that? Are they all just stupid? No, is the answer. Are they all mad? Or are they all, because some people like a sort of conspiracy theory about this, are they all deceived? Well, I think to some extent they are deceived, but I think one again has to recognize that the way we tend to think about things is, and it's very understandable and it's largely correct in our history, if only we could get on with our lives, we would know what to do about it. But that is not the common experience of most of continental Europe, where they have profound suspicions about their own governments, which are mostly justified by modern history. And therefore, in each of these countries, for different reasons, they see in the European Union a way of dissolving or protecting themselves from some of those difficulties and creating a sort of cordon sanitaire that prevents the worst things happening in their countries. And they have not been completely wrong about that. And in many respects, you would have to say that the European Union, at least until recently, had been a success. And even today, you see that European countries that are not in the European Union, but are coming from the East, would like to be in it. Now, the reply to that is, well, of course they would, because they'll get the money. But I mean, that is not a discreditable reason. And it's interesting that they think they will get more money from being in the European Union than not being in it. You know, they could quite simply prove wrong about that, but historically they have been proved right. And this is something which I personally don't know what to conclude, how I should conclude as a result of this. Because when I go to these places, and when I think of what happened to them with the oppression of half of Europe by the Soviet Union and other oppressions, lesser oppressions in Spain, Portugal and so on historically, Greek colonies or whatever, I can't quite answer this point. It seems to me that if people think that they are going to be in a great big democratic alliance of basically free and prosperous countries in the European Union, and they go on thinking that, I can't really completely prove them wrong, and I can't, and I don't think they are completely wrong. So what am I supposed to think about all this? And I'm sharing this with you rather than giving the answer, but I think it's a very important point. And this does worry me very much about what's going to happen now, because I'm absolutely convinced that the European Union as constructed is wrong. And I don't think it's a superficial error, I think it's a profound error, because I think it is a top-down organisation which, because it has this doctrine of the acquis communautaire of the bus that goes in one direction and so on, is anti-democratic, and ultimately unmanageable. But on the other hand, I think sometimes we get so furious with it, we just think, oh, well, how marvellous, it's all going wrong. And I must say, in a way, I feel that every morning in the way it's going. But you know, when a whole continent goes wrong, it is a very, very serious thing. And it's not clear to me that that it is in Britain's interest, however much we dislike it, for it to break up. And again, I don't know what the answer to this is, but I think it's a very serious issue. I would like to think, well, what I would go on to say is that I think the euro has exacerbated this problem, but it's also been very helpful for us Eurosceptics, because the thing about politics is you can go on pretending for almost indefinitely, and it's harder to go on pretending about money almost indefinitely. And because the Europhiles made the mistake of creating the single currency without creating political union, a mistake from their point of view, they are now profoundly exposed. The trouble is, they've also profoundly exposed all the citizens of Europe by their actions, and that includes us, because we are sucked into many of the problems created by the European, by the weakness of the euro. And I come back to the point with which I started, which is just because something doesn't work doesn't mean that it won't happen. Now, British pragmatic people find that very difficult to understand. And I remember John Major saying, when he was arguing in favour of the ERM and against EMU 20 years ago, he said, well, it won't work, so it can't happen. That is a non sequitur. Things constantly happen in politics which don't work. In fact, you could say that politics is largely the experience of things that don't work happening. And indeed, the Soviet Union was an example of something that the Soviet Empire, the communist Soviet Union, was an example of something that never ever worked in any beneficial sense from the beginning, but it lasted for 70 years. The European Union is not nearly such a repulsive organisation, but it's perfectly possible for it to go on for a very long time without really working. And I think it's even possible now it's quite possible that it will continue. It's very interesting that the euro, for example, hasn't collapsed. You would think that given what's going on, what the reality of the situation is, that the markets would flee from the euro. Could still happen, of course, but so far it hasn't. And the reason for that, I think, very broadly expressed, is that the markets believe, and they're probably still right, that the people who run Europe are determined to keep it on the road. Which ultimately means, in the case of the currency, that Germany, whatever its protestations, will stand behind it. I suspect that is still even now true. And so what we're in for, would be my guess, is not some spectacular and exciting collapse, but some prolonged period of misery, leading who knows where. I am very energized by the present crisis, and I think it does provide us with enormous opportunities, but I don't think we have sort of grasped the full extent of this. And when we look at the British government and how irritatingly it behaves about this, one has to have a slight element of sympathy for it, because it is an extremely difficult situation to know what to do about when you are in the middle of this crisis. If the euro were to collapse, it would be a great temporary catastrophe for us as well as for everyone else. On the other hand, I don't believe that survival in present form is a good thing, because it's because of the ultimate political purposes, and I also don't believe it's possible. So I think there will be some great new thing emerging. So what can we, who dislike most of this, do about it? And how can we move forward? And I think one of the great difficulties here is that is a lack of trust, and a lack of trust in our elites. And unfortunately, this lack of trust in our elites is justified. I don't mean by that they're all liars. What I mean is that they will not, if they can possibly avoid it, they will not do what we want. There will not be a British government that wants to get us out of the European Union, or even a British government that really seriously wants to reform the European Union in a way that we would like, or deeply renegotiate Britain's relationship with it. The reason for this is that some people in all British governments really don't want that because they actually don't believe in it. But the even bigger reason is that they just think it's too much of a nightmare to work it out, and that there's only a limited amount of energy that any of them can possibly have. You have to argue with 27 other countries. You probably won't get your way. You have to devote all your time to it. You can't think of all the other things, and of course it provides you with potentially massive internal party problems in your own national politics, from which you may not be the beneficiary. And so I think I thought most of John's arguments were marvellous, but I don't think about time. I think it's a waste of time to think about who's the right Tory leader to do this, because I don't think it's going to be because a sort of wonderful person comes through as a saviour, unless perhaps, you know, everything completely crumbles. Who knows what will happen? But as long as it's there, the British policy elites, whether political parties or civil servants, probably even big business, will continue to think that we've somehow got to rub along with this. So, confronting that, what can we do about it without just screaming insults from the sideline? And here this is why I do think the referendum argument is very, very important. I quite agree with John that the referendum argument should not be a substitute for arguing about what you actually want. We have to think about the content. But it will be through a referendum, I think, and only through a referendum, that things actually change. The reason we're not in the single currency is because there was a threat of a referendum on the subject. And actually, you know, he was hardly a politician at all, and very controversial figure, but Jimmy Goldsmith, by putting up that money and getting the referendum party going, made an absolutely massive difference, because he made all the British political parties promise that they would have a referendum on the single currency, which of course they didn't want. But it gave them pause, and it meant that they didn't quite dare, they nearly got there with Blair in the early days, but they didn't quite dare take us in. And as a result, we've survived, and now we're not going to go in for the foreseeable future. That's completely off the political agenda, even though it's a gleam in a few politicians' eyes, even to this day. So that was because of the threat of a referendum. And what we now, therefore, have to devote an enormous amount of thought to is how we get the right referendum at the right time, or the right promise of a referendum, so that we can really push things in the direction which we seek. And this is the most formidably difficult task, because you have all these questions like, can a referendum just be like an opinion poll? Can it be like a hypothesis? Can it be sort of, what do you think about this? Are you for or against it? Which I doubt whether it can be. Or should it be on a specific proposition? You know, the government says, we want this. Do you say yes or no to it? Those are very difficult questions. There's also the question, should it be in or out? There's a lot to be said for having in or out, but given even today the remaining power of the British establishment, and by which of course I particularly include the BBC, you can be pretty sure that if you have the question phrased and framed as in and out, all sorts of terrors will be incited by the elites among the British people about the consequences of that. So is it possible that we, as it were, get what we wish for and lose? And then there's a question of timing, and there's a question of whether we repose hope chiefly in the Conservative Party, or could it be that actually, because they see the politics of it, Labour gets there first. It's perfectly possible that we'll get a Labour promise of a referendum before we get a Tory one. And I keep telling Tories that because I hope it makes them hurry up. So I'm just throwing these thoughts out. I haven't got the right answer to it, but I think all of us who are Eurosceptics are really challenged now, because what we've been doing for 20 and some wonderful people here for 40 years, maybe even for 50 before we went in, have been arguing and arguing and arguing against something. And therefore, we have been assailing the powerful. Very good thing to do. But we actually are now attaining much more power. Things are coming our way. So how are we going to handle that? How are we going to move from being a series of furious ginger groups and brilliant pamphleteers and columnists who shout our heads off and so on? How are we going to move into that, to be a movement where we can bring about what we want, as has happened with great movements in the past, like Vote for Women or some such cause? How do we turn that into something where, instead of the melancholy experience of just being right, we actually get what we want? That's the question we need to discuss. Thank you.